while ago, I beat Terraria's Skyblock map, and while that was challenging enough, the one block mod takes it a step further by starting you off in a completely empty world outside of one single block. So, I wanted to see if I was able to beat Terraria only using one block, which is exactly what I attempt in this video. Before we jump into the playthrough though, I need to give a quick explanation of how the mod works, but if you want to skip straight to the playthrough, then you can go to the timestamp I have on screen now. This mod makes a world that is completely empty, outside of one special block. This block will auto-replace itself each time it's broken into different blocks, which is the only way to get the resources to beat the game, with more blocks getting added to the pool of blocks it has the chance to be as you beat the bosses. Outside of the world, this mod also adds in some of its own items to make this possible, like a craftable Lunatic Cultist spawner, and craftable health upgrades using fishing crates. But outside of those few things, everything else, like progression, is just normal Terraria. So we can finally jump into the playthrough now. Once I got into my empty world, the very first thing I did was spend a while mining the one block in my world. But once I felt like I had enough random materials, I stopped and started building my first structure. I knew that I needed some way to easily farm enemies, so I decided to make a lava pit setup above the special block, which allowed me to mine the block while collecting enemy loot. The next day, I got started on building the first NPC house, but that's when I realized that you could craft fishing crates, which could be a great way to get some life crystals. To make most of the crates, I needed buckets of water, but because I didn't want to waste any of the starting resources I spawned with, I just went ahead and made a liquid duplication setup, which works by making the liquid fall down both sides of a block, while you also spam the collect button. Once I had that set up, I went back over to the only workbench I had at the time, made 27 ocean crates, and then opened all of them, which ended up giving me some fishing bait, some ore, a ton of tridents, but no life crystals sadly. After this, I spent some time mining the special block, and then made some more crafting stations so I could use my ore, alongside some chests so I could finally free up some space in my inventory. While I was organizing my items and doing upgrades, I realized that I could make a platinum crown, which also meant I could make King Slime spawner, so I went ahead and did that. After I made it though, I realized that I didn't really have anywhere to fight him, alongside the fact that my gear wasn't too good at this point. So I extended out the platform to the right side, and then spent a while mining the block to upgrade my gear, which is when I not only managed to get an Eye of Cthulhu spawner, but I also got my first 5 life crystals of the playthrough. Now that I finally had some more health and better gear, I thought I should try to take on King Slime. Most of the time, I beat King Slime by making it jump into lava while teleporting after me. And that's almost exactly what I tried here, with me trying to get King Slime stuck in the small lava pit while I used the magic mirror to get away from it. The fight was going well for the most part, but I ended up dying towards the very end. But I had the materials to go ahead and try King Slime again, so I did. But this time, King Slime fell through my floor as soon as it spawned in, and eventually despawned. I tried spawning in King Slime one more time, but it also ended up falling through the floor. So I decided to make an entire setup dedicated to beating bosses above my platform, so that way, when King Slime did fall through the floor, it would just fall onto the platform instead of nothing at all. As soon as I got done building that, I spawned in King Slime and was able to easily beat him by just running around the pool of lava. But I didn't end up getting any of the items I actually wanted from King Slime, so I knew I was gonna have to fight it again in the future. In the meantime though, my next goal was to beat the Eye of Cthulhu. So I mined at the special block until it was night, and then went over to my setup to use the suspicious looking eye. This fight was a little harder than King Slime's, and the slippery ice didn't make it any better. But eventually, I beat it, and got some Crimtane ore, alongside a single Crimson Seed. After this, I started making some much needed NPC houses, and then finally started expanding the left side of my platform, which is where I ended up getting a good amount of lenses. So, because I still needed Crimson related items, I decided to fight the Eye of Cthulhu again once I got back to my base. Once I beat that though, I realized that I had more than enough gold to make some more golden fishing grates, which I could then use to craft 5 life crystals. After I started actually crafting them though, I found out that I had enough to upgrade my health to the current max. Once I finished all of that up though, I then started making my pond, which may seem like a weird idea at first. But fishing is actually an easy way to get a ton of great items. Plus, I needed a way to get rid of my surplus of fishing bait. I made the pond by just duplicating water, and then I made a crimson fishing rod to finally do the fishing. Once I got done building, I thought it would be a good time to try King Slime again, and luckily, this time around, I got the item I wanted, the Solidifier, which may seem weird, but it would allow me to turn gel from slimes into blocks. After this, I quickly made another row of houses, and then got started on making the Crimson biome. I only had a few seeds, but luckily that was enough, as it wasn't long at all before Crimson enemies started spawning in. Aside from the biome itself, I also thought it was a good idea to make another lava pit setup here, as not only would it allow me to farm enemies easily, but I could also make another NPC house in it, which came in handy pretty fast, as the next night, a blood moon happened. So I was able to just buy the last set of items I needed for the Brain of Cthulhu spawner. I went ahead and crafted the spawner, but when I went to try and use it, I realized that my Crimson biome wasn't big enough yet. So I had to push off this fight until later. After placing some more dirt blocks in my Crimson area, I then went to work on a way down to the underworld, so that way I could start preparing for the Wall of Flesh fight. Since there's absolutely nothing in the world, and the player's reach is only a few blocks without extra items, the only option I had was to build downward by placing a wooden platform on almost every tile, which luckily only caused me to fall off a few times. Once I finally reached the underworld, I started making a bridge, expanding out from both sides of my elevator down. And I also made a small pit of lava using the liquid duplication glitch, so that way I could actually spawn the Wall of Flesh when ready. By the time I placed about 500 blocks on each side, I had a couple of voodoo dolls. And since I was tired of constantly falling off and dying, I decided to go and see if my Crimson biome was finally big enough to fight the Brain of Cthulhu. And luckily it was. I quickly went ahead and made a small setup in the Crimson biome, so I could get away and around the boss, and then I started the fight. This fight was pretty easy with the help of the setup, and by the time it got to its second phase, I was able to keep knocking it back using a yo-yo, so it wasn't long before I eventually beat it. Once I got all of the dropped loot, I went back to base, made some Crimtane gear, and then started mining on the special block, as Meteorite and Evil biome ores got added to the pool of blocks I could get after beating the Brain of Cthulhu. After a while of that, I got bored and moved back to working towards the Wall of Flesh fight by expanding the bridge some more. But eventually, I started to feel like it was finally long enough on each side. So I went over to my lava puddle and threw in the doll to start the fight. This started out pretty well, with the Wall of Flesh not being able to damage me too much, and me damaging it mainly using a diamond staff. But shortly after getting its health to a little under the halfway point, I ended up reaching the end of my bridge, which caused me to fall off. And even though I did manage to teleport back to my base, I still died regardless. I decided to try and fight it again, to see if I just had bad luck the first time around. But after I ended up dying for the same reason, I knew that I was gonna have to change some stuff up to be able to beat it. I decided to expand the bridge out, and after I finished that, then I went to the end of the bridge's left side so I could make another lava pit to spawn the wall of flesh here, instead of in the middle of the world. Once all of that was done, I went ahead and spawned in the wall of flesh. And this time around, with the longer bridge, I was finally able to defeat it. All of its loot ended up spawning pretty far up in the air, since my bridge was so low. So I had to build up to it while dealing with the enemies. But eventually, I got up there and got the loot. I went back to my base after this and did some inventory management, and then started mining the special block to see if I could get anything new. Which is when I realized that all of the hard mode ores got added to the pool of blocks I could get. So I spent some more time mining, and eventually made an entire set of Orichalcum armor. After this though, I knew I needed to get back to working on the bosses, and the next 3 were the mech bosses. To craft their spawners, I needed souls of night and light. So I started out by going to the underworld to collect the night souls. But then for the souls of light, I knew I was gonna have to make my own hallow biome. So that's what I got to work on. I first did some more mining to get a ton of pearl stone, then went down to my elevator to the underworld until I felt like I was deep enough, and started making a small underground hallow farm. During this, I ended up finding the wizard, and of course, almost fell down to my death once. But eventually, it was finished, which is when I got the bright idea to sit and see if I could get the 1 in 500 Rod of Discord. I ended up giving this about 3 hours before I eventually realized that I wasn't gonna get it. But on the other hand, I did manage to get a new magic weapon and 2 of the mech boss spawners, which made it worth it to me in the end. I went back up to my base so I could craft the last mech boss spawner, and then, once it was night, I went ahead and spawned in the first mech boss, which was the twins in this case. Almost immediately, I realized that this fight was pretty tough, so I ended up having to mainly use my magic mirror to keep getting away from them. But luckily, I was eventually able to defeat both of them, giving me my first few hallowed bars. This fight made me realize that I needed to make a new setup to fight bosses in. And after tossing around a few ideas in my head, I eventually landed on making a Hoik setup. I made it to where there were small gaps at the end of the Hoik, so you could stop and attack the boss, while also making it have 2 layers with platforms leading up. So that way, I could go back or forward easily whenever I wanted. Once I finished that up, it was finally starting to turn nighttime. So I went ahead and spawned in the next boss, Skeletron Prime. This fight was definitely easier with the Hoik setup, but even with that, Skeletron Prime was still pretty tough for me, especially with the gear I was limited to. Eventually, I got to the point where I stopped going through the Hoiks and just spammed attacked it using my Falcon Blade, until I finally defeated it, leaving only 1 more mech boss for me to beat. Instead of going straight to fight the Destroyer though, I realized that if I wanted to try and beat the boss after the Destroyer, Plantera, then I'd need to make an underground jungle setup. So I got started on that. I went a little past the Hallow Farm down my elevator, and then started building the setup on the left side. This setup is literally just a few rows of mud that you plant with jungle seeds, and then you can get life fruits and Plantera bulbs to grow on them. So it didn't take too long for me to finish building. After that though, I got back to fighting the bosses, which meant it was time to spawn in the Destroyer. This fight ended up being the easiest one of the 3 mech bosses, with me doing most of my attacks while shooting through whatever Hoik the Destroyer was going across, and then running through other Hoiks while I healed. But when I was just about to defeat it, I got careless and tried to rush my next attack, and ended up dying. Luckily though, the next night, I was finally able to beat it, using the same strategy I used the first time around. With the mech bosses out of the way, it was time for Plantera. So I went down to my underground jungle to see how it was doing. But not only was there nothing useful there yet, it also wasn't even fully grown in yet. I decided to make a few more layers on top to hopefully give me better chances at getting the Plantera bulb. But while I was doing that, I realized the mod adds in a craftable Plantera spawner. I just need lizard blocks, which I ended up getting from the special block, and sadly, a moon glow, which would grow in the little jungle. So regardless of if I crafted the spawner or smashed a Plantera bulb, I was still gonna have to wait a while they grow. So I started out by spending time at the Hallow Farm and checking in on the Jungle Farm every so often, but eventually I got tired of that. So I just boxed myself in at the Jungle Farm and started waiting. Eventually, a Plantera bulb did grow, but I wanted to try and craft the spawner instead, since that would allow me to spawn it near my Hoik setup, instead of having to make an entire new setup near this Jungle Farm. So I kept waiting some more, and eventually a moon glow finally grew. So I grabbed it, teleported back up to my base, made the Plantera spawner, and then immediately spawned it in. This fight ended up being pretty tough, and it didn't help that Plantera was in her enraged mode, since we weren't in an underground jungle biome. I started out by trying to continuously shoot my crystal vial shard while constantly going through the Hoiks, but that wasn't dealing damage fast enough. So I ended up going with the same strategy I used on the Destroyer, which was just me going through the Hoik Plantera was currently near while spam swinging my Excalibur. Eventually, using that strategy, I finally ended up defeating Plantera. Right after beating it though, I realized that I still had the Plantera spawner, so I tried using it again to see if it had unlimited uses, thinking that if Plantera does spawn, it'll just despawn when I die. Well, I was right in the fact that the spawner has unlimited uses. But I was completely wrong on the despawning part, as it just went straight to my spawn after I died. I tried jumping down to the Hallow Farm and dying, thinking that would bring Plantera down far enough that it would despawn before I respawned, but that didn't end up working. So, after I respawned from that mistake, I then tried to get past the Hallow Farm by going down the platforms before jumping down to the underworld, which ended up working. As I'm actually making this video, I'm now realizing I could have just easily closed the world and reopened it. But hey, you live and learn. Hopefully. Now that Plantera was defeated, it was time for Golem. But I had no idea about how I'd actually go about spawning it in. Before this, I would just go into the mod section in the recipe browser to see what I thought was all of the crafting recipes in the 1-block mod, as the Steam page for the mod really only told me a quick summary of the mod. But there weren't any Jungle Temple or Golem related items there. I ended up finding out that if a mod has a crafting recipe for vanilla, it won't show up in the mod section at all, and instead will show up in the recipe browser's vanilla item section. After I learned that, I ended up finding out that I can make the lizard altar and sell using jungle fishing crates. And those could be crafted using tokens crafted with various ores. So, since I already had everything needed to make them, that's exactly what I did, with me placing the lizard altar right above my crafting area. This is also when I found out I could use the crates to make life fruits. So I went ahead and fully maxed out my HP using them. And since I was at max health now, I decided to just go ahead and try to fight Golem. I used one of the lizard cells I made on the altar, and as soon as Golem spawned in, I started spamming it with my crystal vial shard, which was surprisingly taking its health down a lot faster than I thought it would have. I knew that the Hoik setup wouldn't work on Golem, so instead, I just kept looping in between the Hoik and King Slime setup, while also using the magic mirror to get away quickly sometimes. But after using the mirror after apparently bringing Golem out too far, it ended up despawning. Thinking I just got really bad luck there, I respawned it and started the fight again using the same strategy, until Golem ended up despawning without me even using the magic mirror. This made me realize that I was gonna need to stay as close to Golem as possible for this fight, which is exactly what I did in the third attempt. Staying close to Golem ended up being the trick that I needed, as even though it did end up taking a while, eventually I finally defeated it. And with that, it was finally time to take on Terraria's final bosses, starting with the Cultist. Normally, the Cultist spawns in the dungeon, but that's not an option in this mod. So instead, we have to craft the Lunatic Cultist spawner. To make it, I need to get some sapphire, which I wasn't able to get from the special block. I had to go build a small platform underground to farm granite elementals and golems, until I got a geode that gave me the sapphire I needed, which luckily didn't end up taking too long. Right after this, I immediately went back to my base, crafted the spawner, and started the fight. My plan for this was just gonna be the Hoik setup, and surprisingly, this ended up pretty well, with me taking off large chunks of its health whenever I attacked it. At least at first, as it wasn't long before I apparently got too far away from the boss, making it despawn. After letting the Cultist's dragon finish me off, I realized that I totally forgot to expand my platform to span across the entire world, as that was something that I thought I would 100% need to fight Moonlord. So I spent a while doing that. Adding the extra space to get away from Moonlord wasn't the only thing I needed though, as I also needed a mount to be able to get away from Moonlord fast enough. So I also made a Hallow biome to try and get the unicorn mount. But that never even ended up happening, as I ended up getting the werewolf mount instead, not too long after making the Hallow biome. With those two new additions, and some idea of what to expect of the Cultist in my Hoik setup, I used the spawner to start the fight again. This time around, I figured out I can easily take care of the dragon by shooting my magic weapon while going through 2 Hoiks, alongside the fact that if I got the Cultist right above my platforms to get to top level, then some of its attacks wouldn't even be able to hurt me, giving me free time to just spam attacks on it. With those 2 tricks, I eventually was able to just barely beat the Cultist. Right after this though, the Pillar spawned in, which normally wouldn't be a problem. But they all ended up spawning well below the bridge I made expanding across the entire world. And with how often enemies spawn from there, I had no chance at being able to build another bridge where they spawned at. I decided that I would first try and beat the pillar directly to the right of my base, which was the Vortex Pillar. Not really knowing what to do in this situation, I started building out a bridge from my elevator. And as soon as I got into the pillar's area, the enemies immediately started spawning like I thought they would, so I had to stop building. Again, still not really knowing how I'd actually defeat the pillar, I just kept going down to the little bridge I made for the pillar, killing as many enemies as I could before dying, and then repeating that process over and over again, until I eventually took down the pillar's shield. At this point, I realized that really the only way I was gonna be actually able to damage the pillar is by going on to my bridge across my world, making a hole above the pillar, and then jumping down to attack the pillar as I'm falling. So that's exactly what I started doing. As you can most likely guess, this ended up taking a super long time, since I could only deal a few hundred damage each time I jumped down. But eventually, I was finally able to take it out, since I figured out a way to beat the Vortex Pillar, regardless of how painfully long it is. I went into the second pillar fight planning to do the same thing, but without building an extra bridge, since that didn't work out with the Vortex Pillar. This next pillar I chose to do was the one directly to the left of my base, which was the Stardust one. And since it was right under my Hoik setup, it made the process a lot quicker. It wasn't too long before its shield was down, so I ended up making the hole in the bridge in the middle of a Hoik, so that way I could leave spawn and quickly jump down to damage the pillar. And with that, it wasn't long before the Stardust pillar was finally defeated. The last 2 pillars were on the far sides of my world, which were the Solar and Nebula pillars. Having them on the far sides of the world ended up making this whole process take a lot longer, since it takes so long to even reach them. But eventually, I defeated both of them, using the same strategy I used on the other 2 pillars, and started the minute countdown for Moonlord to spawn in. Knowing that this fight would most likely be a learning attempt for me, I just stood over my lava pit while waiting for Moonlord to spawn. And once it did, I went into my Hoik, and quickly realized that going through the Hoiks over and over again actually worked out pretty well. So, instead of using the bridge that spanned across the world, I decided to just stay here and try my luck. I ended up having to mainly use my possessed hatchet to deal most of the damage, as it was the only thing that could stay on Moonlord while I was zooming through the Hoiks. Eventually though, to my surprise, between my potions, the werewolf mount, Hoiks, and the hatchet, I got it down to half of its health. And then, after what felt like way too much time, it was finally down to its last bit of health. I started to get a little cocky here, thinking that I made it this far, so I stopped going through the Hoiks to attack it. And luckily, by the skin of my teeth, I was able to take out that last bit of health and defeat Moonlord, meaning I finally beat Terraria's 1-block mod. And that wraps up this video. Just like a lot of my playthroughs, I published my world, so that way you guys can check it out if you want. Mobile users can get the world file from my Discord server, and PC users can find the world on Terraria's Steam Workshop. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Terraria videos like this in the future. And as always, make sure to have a wonderful day.